Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're just going to take one more minute to let everyone log in and get started in a moment or two. Thank you very much. Good morning. We will be waiting just one more minute so that we give everybody a chance to settle in and to log in, and we'll start very shortly. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to this ECFR webinar on critical minerals and EU-Africa strategic partnerships. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us today. There's a record number of registrations for a topic which is obviously of interest to a great number of stakeholders. We propose to first have 1 hour of panel discussion with our esteemed panelists before opening it up to questions from the audience. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to try to address them. We might put some together so that we can raise these questions in the final section of the event. A recording will be made available online very rapidly. And as we discuss, we may cite some reports or other resources which will be linked in the chat so that you can find those quite easily. So I see we're still missing one panelist, but hopefully they will join as we proceed. Let me then get started in our discussions. And before I introduce you to our amazing panel, perhaps remind us why we're here to discuss this topic today. The EU's drive to diversify its mineral value chains has led to the signing of strategic partnerships with resource-rich countries in Africa and globally. Since 2022, the EU signed partnerships with Namibia, DRC, Zambia, and Rwanda, and of course has been part of a multi-stakeholder partnership for the development of the Lobito corridor. The stated objective of these partnerships is to integrate industrial and mineral value chains with the partner countries and to cooperate with strategic partners to identify strategic projects. So the goal very much here is to balance the interests of partners for mutually beneficial outcomes. We're almost 2 years since the signing of the first strategic partnership with Namibia. Where do we stand? Let's be honest, progress is limited and many challenges persist. ECFR has delved into the specifics of the Namibia strategic partnership and continues to work on all of the strategic partnerships in Africa and how they can participate in reshaping the EU-Africa relationship, not only on minerals, but also considering energy and development stakes more widely. To realize its ambitions, the EU will need to engage with the private sector, both within and outside its border. We need to structure, fund, and implement a whole series of projects, but also make sure that these are interconnected in a way that we actually achieve the redesign of the mineral value chains that is at the heart of this agenda. In the context of the strategic partnerships with African countries, this will mean bringing to the table, aside from the policy actors and institutions, the global mining sector operating in Africa, the investors and financiers who back these operations, European industrial actors, because part of the industrialization agenda is also recreating or developing those linkages, as well as, of course, African actors for industrialization. At the moment, not many of those are engaged in the discussions. And yet, simultaneously, expectations around critical minerals are shifting in resource-rich regions, and strategies and frameworks are emerging to leverage this mineral wealth for wider economic and social benefit. This is the case everywhere. We're seeing these strategies in Australia, in Canada, in all of the mineral producing regions. In Africa specifically, a green mineral strategy is taking shape, which aims to revolutionize Africa's minerals-based industrialization by proactively engaging with the new conditions arising from the energy transition and enhancing the existing bodies of mineral development policies. So we have a lot of expectations on both sides. We have stated intentions to create mutually beneficial relationships. Can these strategic partnerships actually deliver on those promises? Can they meet expectations? Are the EU's policy goals aligned with market realities to attract private sector investment in Africa? And also, how are African actors taking their role in redefining these value chains? To discuss these trends, to ask these questions, and to assess how European and African actors can mobilize to define and realize these shared ambitions, and also in a context of rising geopolitical tensions, we are lucky to have the benefit of key actors in the policy, finance, and markets perspectives who can raise their different views with us today. Let me very quickly introduce the panelists, and then we will move on to some of our discussion. Mr. Andrea Clerici is the head of corporate finance and global activities with the European Investment Bank. The EIB, of course, has a key role to play in shaping the European CRM agenda, mapping priorities in its implementation. And let's be honest, the bank's repositioning on critical minerals, aligning with European industrial and sourcing strategies, is a game changer for the EU, much anticipated by the private sector, and a key part of the evolving relationship with strategic partners. Mr. Junior Lodge, the Assistant Secretary General for Structural Economic Transformation and Trade with the Secretariat of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, will be discussing with us a recent report on the production and trade of CRMs in support of emerging strategies amongst the OACPS members, including the African Green Mineral Strategy, and very much bringing us this perspective of how new expectations are reshaping the criticality narrative. Vitor Correa, who is Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory, has long experience assessing how the criticality agenda impacts investment and trading markets, as well as cooperation, and participates in the implementation of strategic partnerships in Africa, in part through the Africa Maval project, and will share with us his perspective on progress to date and implementation. So why don't we get started, perhaps with you, Mr. Clerici? As we've just raised in the introduction, the EIB is aligning with the EU's critical mineral priorities and is taking new positions, is a part and an actor in the strategic partnerships in Africa. Could you share with us some perspectives on that? And also discuss how you look at the African landscape and the strategic partnerships in shaping your positions and initiatives.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning from Luxembourg, and thanks for inviting the EIB to this webinar. The European Investment Bank, first of all, agrees that the investments in critical raw materials will be crucial to maintaining Europe's stronger manufacturing leadership and competitiveness. And in fact, the CRM are specifically listed in the EIB 2024-2027 strategic roadmap. In recent years, the bank has been active in supporting significant investments in projects related to decarbonization of industry, electrification, digitalization, and manufacturing. All of these with a specific focus on innovation and climate, but increasingly with a reference to the critical raw material supply chains. In this sense, the bank is fully aligning with the EU critical priorities in a way that by supporting, let's say, efforts to secure sustainable and resilient supply of critical raw materials to Europe, and in particular through investment in strategic partnership, including Africa. How is the EIB contributing to this? I would mention briefly four key areas. The first is the most obvious. The bank is financing CRM projects. The EIB is providing financial support for projects across CRM value chain, and this includes mining, processing, and recycling, in line, once again, with the EU goal of reducing dependency on external supplies and diversifying the supply chains. For this, we back both projects in Europe and with strategic partnership in third countries, particularly in resource-rich regions like Africa. The second is exactly what you mentioned before, strategic partnership. The EIB is working closely with African nations, which are key supplier of CRM, like cobalt and rare earth. And this partnership have a key feature, are also meant to help Africa to develop its own resources in a sustainable way, which is particularly important for the bank, as well as obviously ensuring a reliable and diversified supply of CRMs to the EU. In particular, I want to mention one strategic partnership that the bank has signed. It has been the first that the bank has signed directly at the end of last year, in December 2023. Rwanda and the EIB have agreed on new critical raw material investment partnership, which aims at enhancing the critical raw material value chain. This is the first critical raw material agreement between the European Investment Bank and an African partner. And we are working together to unlock new investment opportunities, to create new jobs, and hence contribute to a responsible development of essential resources. The third point that I want to mention is at the heart of the bank, which is sustainability and circular economy. The EIB, as the EU bank, ensures that all the projects financed by the bank should comply with the EU strict environmental and social standards. And hence, we want to promote responsible mining, sustainable processing, and the circular economy principles. The fourth point that I want to mention, as obviously the EIB is a European institution, but also a bank, is that we look at risk mitigation and value chain development. We want to finance infrastructure and CRM-related projects in Africa, and the EIB can help in mitigate the risks which are associated to supply chain disruption, and hence, in a way, enhancing the EU access to this critical raw material. At the same time, as I said, with the goal to support economies and development in the African partner countries. So in a nutshell, as you can see, these efforts are very much aligned to the EU broader strategy to diversify the supply chain, to reduce the strategic dependency, and to foster the international cooperation, which are the key, let's say, parameters which are in the Critical Raw Material Act defined by the EU.
Thank you very much for that. And as you were saying, the EIB is a policy actor and a bank. So straddling these different lines and connecting those perspectives is essential to what we need to achieve with the strategic partnerships at the moment. Mr. Lodge, I'm going to come to you next. We've definitely seen an evolution in the approach by the EU to strategic partnerships, and very much a move from staking a position to organizing for action and integrating the strategic partnerships in a wider set of relationships. So you've been participating in a thought process for some of your African members and African countries more widely, seeking to determine how they can mobilize to make themselves attractive to investors while simultaneously ensuring that sufficient benefits accrue locally, that we have the best performance in terms of environmental and social protection, as well as the economic development expectations. Are any countries or regions particularly advanced? How would you describe some of the emerging positions and expectations? And more importantly, how do you see this linking to some of the wider relationship frameworks with the EU?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, and deeply appreciate the initiative to have this kind of discourse. So greatly appreciative of the opportunity also of presenting the OECPS. In the first instance, we need to recognize that this is a group of 79 countries that are defined by various degrees of vulnerabilities. So whether it is LDCs, with their vulnerability expressed in acute poverty, whether it is SIDS, with their vulnerability expressed in terms of serial exposure to climate change, landlocked countries which have rather reduced access to trade infrastructure, middle-income countries which have zero access to concessionary financing. So vulnerability is, in a sense, the defining thread among OECPS countries. There are other manifestations, whether it is in terms of the challenge posed by fragile states, which of course is also an issue of governance, but key also for this discussion is the fact that we're commodity dependent. 83% of LDCs have high commodity dependence. And so we need to anchor this discussion on critical raw materials in that context, because we have had this long-standing partnership with the European Union to a large extent. When it was first founded in 1975, it was revolutionary, because in fact, one of the challenges was making sure that we are supported on our path towards industrialization. And in some instances that materialize, but rather certainly the last 30 years, we have seen, if not a reversal of that thrust. So our determination is to ensure that we can indeed use our rich holdings of critical raw materials to bolster our sustainable development ambition. I think another key data point, which is important here, is, and it underscores the paradox of the OECPS, is that we are indeed rich in holdings of critical raw materials. I have some data in terms of rhodium. OECPS countries produce 91%, 82% of platinum, 78% of cobalt, tantalum, 62.5%, manganese, 61%, chromium, 57%, and palladium, 46%. So these are all essential items required for the digital and green transition. And by the way, not just of the European Union, but also of ours. And yet, our countries remain poor. 38 of the 79 countries are LDCs. And in fact, this paradox is best exemplified by the Democratic Republic of Congo. DRC produces 70% of the global production of cobalt, and yet it remains an LDC. So I think it is important that we anchor this exchange in terms of the not only the long-term ambition of OECPS countries to escape commodity dependence, to escape immeasurizing poverty, but also to use its wealth of critical raw materials to motor forward. So that's an important element. Obviously, we note what has emerged with respect to the CRM Act, and of course, because it entails of the 11 MOUs that have been concluded thus far, 4 with African countries, as you rightly mentioned, Madam Chairperson. We have a strong interest in this, but of course, as a group of countries, and we have had a long history of this, which is we felt it was important to draft an overarching policy with specific orientations aimed at trying to escape commodity dependence, and most importantly, trying to advance our sustainable development. So what does it entail in terms of our position paper? The key is to recognize that this, although we are talking about critical raw materials, they should not be reduced to specific products. Rather, critical raw materials are 2 things. One, they are value chains. So they are linked, obviously, to renewable energy, because especially if you want to move up the value chain, you need energy. That is a critical input. And here we have an opportunity, because we're talking about sustainability in terms of motoring renewable energy, and especially in Africa. I have some data also on this, where there is a very, very strong, there's a strong energy potential. We're looking at 10 terawatts of solar power, 350 gigawatts of hydroelectric energy, 10 gigawatts of wind, 20 gigawatts of geothermal power. So renewable energy is essential and critical. But of course, it is also linked to health, to education, to technology transfer, to skills partnerships, social and environmental standards that you mentioned in your question, and of course, support for mining communities, electrification. Now, I'll just give you one example of seeing this critical raw materials in this broad context. Imagine if we can develop and produce batteries based upon our wealth of lithium holdings, batteries that can electrify communities, that schools can benefit from that, hospitals can benefit from that. So it is not simply about developing renewable energy to process raw materials, but also to make sure that local communities can also benefit. So again, it is those linkages. But the second element in terms of seeing critical raw materials is also to locate it as an intersection between trade, sustainability, technology, partnerships, and in particular, whether it is diplomatic partnerships or military partnerships. So the criticality of critical raw materials is broader than simply just seeing it as a particular product. And I think given the thrust of your own organization, I think this location in a broader geostrategic dimension is important. So let me quickly enumerate what are the elements in terms of what we consider key aspects for an equitable OECPS EU strategic partnership on critical raw materials. What are the elements? Local value addition. Because again, the thrust is towards industrialization, beneficiation, value addition. That's the first. The second, sustainable and responsible mining. So again, to make sure that environmental standards can be met. But of course, that requires a sustained capacity building, and in particular for artisanal and small scale miners, because we know that with respect to most critical raw materials, this is where they are the core producers, and yet they tend to be the one that are bereft of the ability to uphold strong environmental, social, and health standards. Infrastructure. Of course, we see this in terms of the Lobito corridor and the need for sound infrastructure to harness the holdings of critical raw materials. But of course, linked to that is in terms of capacity buildings, whether it is in terms of energy grids and digital infrastructure. And in fact, digital infrastructure is for us also essential because it is also linked, for example, to transparency, to the ability to verify that standards are being maintained and upheld. Resource management, again, is linked to digital infrastructure. The fourth element is in terms of transparency and inclusive government. So again, coming back to digitalization and the opportunity to promote transparent governance frameworks to ensure that resource extraction is indeed not only beneficial, but is documented as thus. And then the fifth element is technology and knowledge transfer. So there is a composite element in terms of our approach to harnessing critical raw materials. And of course, we recognize that this is the thrust also of the strategic partnerships that are being pursued by the European Union. But essentially also, we see a very, very strong support for our position emanating from the UN Secretary General's expert panel on critical raw materials. So there are 7 guidelines that were enumerated, including respect for human rights, including transparency, including making sure that we have capacity building. And therefore, we see an international thrust in terms of being able to push this agenda forward. I'll end with just a brief comment in terms of where we are with respect to implementation of the strategic partnerships. One of the first strategic partnerships that was concluded with an African country by the EU was with Namibia. And I know that this is where there's a thrust or a focus on green hydrogen, and there has been not only sustained intervention, support, interaction by the European Union with Namibia, but also there's a Team Europe approach. So Belgium, for example, and Enabel in particular, has been active in terms of trying to facilitate support. I know that UNIDO has also been involved. And most importantly, and I think this is also very, very crucial to anchor this debate, which is a number of OECPS countries have already crafted their own national strategies on critical raw materials. Namibia was one where, again, it focused on green hydrogen. So in other words, there is already a policy framework which is allowing these countries to advance their respective interests, but we also recognize that there's a regional dimension to critical raw materials. If you see, for example, some of the value chains that are emerging between DRC Congo and Zambia, we know, as you mentioned again in your introductory remarks, that there's an African green mineral strategy. So we are seeking to locate our strategy for 79 countries in that context. And I conclude by recognizing that for us, this is also an opportunity for a different approach to sustainable development, an approach to sustainable development where it recognizes, A, the power of an industrial strategy, because in a sense, that's what the EU Green Deal is about. Secondly, that it makes a very explicit link to a whole host of other interventions. So whether it is in terms of the Global Greenway, facilitating investment or capacity building, or bringing the EIB on board. And thirdly, that in order to harness this as a real partnership based upon equity, fairness, and justice, we need the active support and intervention of OECPS stakeholders in order to ensure its sustainability. And I think with that, I'd like to end. And of course, I remain very much receptive to any questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for spotlighting, I think, one of the most interesting dynamics of the last year is that criticality has gone from a customer or consumer-driven narrative to one that is very much now emerging across all levels of the value chain with very different perspectives. So how we balance and reconcile these perspectives, and more importantly, how we shape the tools to achieve those ambitions. You mentioned beneficiation and industrialization. I think will be key to success. I'm delighted that Isabelle Magne has been able to join us. Thank you very much. I see that Zoom has been tricky this morning, so I appreciate you joining. Isabelle is the team leader, value chains and CRMs with DG INTPA, and of course, very much at the helm of a lot of the strategic partnerships, actions and initiatives coordinating across the European institutions. So Isabelle, if I may, I will come to you. We've heard from Mr. Clerici how EIB has really repositioned and aligned with a lot of the EU critical mineral priorities, including in the context of strategic partnerships. Mr. Lodge just discussed with us a little bit the other side of that conversation and the rising expectations and positions from many of the partners and from their own partners and ecosystem. Could you please just update us on the evolving approach to strategic partnerships and how the EU aims to fundamentally improve the risk profile of mining and minerals projects in Africa, which is at the heart of the entire strategy. And we mentioned when we started off the emergence of strategic partnerships, but also of strategic projects. So if you could perhaps map for us how these concepts dovetail and what's the outlook going forward. Oh. I think Isabelle is muted. Can we give her a hand to unmute? Isabelle, I don't know if you can hear us. I think you are unfortunately muted. Oh dear. Well, Zoom is definitely up to its tricks. What I propose, let's perhaps pick up these questions in discussion with Vitor, who's been seeing these strategic projects also from the inside. And perhaps we'll return to more of the policy perspective with Isabelle shortly. Oh, I see we've lost Isabelle. I mean, Vitor, you heard what we were discussing and also some of the questions that we are raising in terms of the outlook for strategic partnerships. You've been following this. Are there already some first lessons we can draw? Are we seeing an evolution? What are some of the gaps that we need to consider? And more importantly, what's the outlook in terms of priorities and pathways that we can, foster in the next few years to make the strategic partnerships more of a success?
Well, thank you so much, Ludovine, for having me here. And also thank you to the European Council on Foreign Relations for organizing this workshop. As you mentioned, the International Raw Materials Observatory observes, and we have been looking with interest not only to the European perspective, but also to the global perspective. And I would say that the European overview is, the European policy makers, or we as European, we are quite good in defining policies and umbrellas that are quite advanced. I mean, with the OACP countries, OACP CS countries, we have for instance, the post-Cotonou agreement, we have the Global Gateway Initiative, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act and the trade agreements that we have been pushing forward. The problem normally happens at I would say, when we have a sort of crash test with reality. And when we have this, when we are facing reality on the field, then we have problems, and this is when coherence and clarity normally are missing, because at the implementation stage, sometimes we realize that, for instance, the values that we have for the respect of human rights, having free trade, all these things are not really the same that different competitors are using in the same space. And this was not like that. I mean, before 2001, the EU and the US were basically outsourcing these raw materials wherever they existed. But then things changed. And now the competition, everyone thinks about China, but it's not only China. We also have the Arab states now actively investing in mining, because they realize that controlling this value chain is important. And things are more complex than that, meaning that when we are talking about increasing from the African perspective or the developing countries' perspective, trying to increase their domestic contribution to the value chain, sometimes this is also difficult because you need to have a market. I mean, it's not sufficient to say that we have an excellent geological endowment, because if you want to transform and to add value on site, you need to combine the market size and the geological endowment. And that combination is not always feasible. I mean, it's feasible, for instance, in the US, because they have a neighbor that has the minerals. So with an excellent mineral endowment, also the US, and they also have a huge market. For the European Union, we are in a different situation. We have the market and we don't have the mineral endowment, or we are facing domestic opposition and many constraints. So all these things make reality much more complex, and it's difficult to implement solutions that are working everywhere. I mean, Mr. Clenchi mentioned the Rwanda MOU that was signed, and I remember that some partners or some stakeholders in Congo were complaining, saying that Rwanda, according to them, has been financing the M23 movement and basically destabilizing all the North Kivu region. And then the EU is like facing, what shall we do? Because we want to follow these, let's say, these principles, which are EU oriented. And then in reality, we are facing problems because the other countries, and again, competition is much more pragmatic. They are saying there, but much of them, they are saying to the local politicals that they don't care about their governance issues, or they don't care about anything. They are just there to make business, and they won't interfere in their political sphere. And that, of course, is something that is difficult for the EU to solve. What the European Union is trying to do, and it's also creating constraints, I would say internal constraints, is looking to like-minded countries. And you see that 2 days ago on the side of the UN General Assembly, there was this news of the Mineral Security Partnership. So we are talking about 14 countries, and that includes, of course, the US, Australia, Canada. So if you want the Western aligned countries, they are trying to collect money. The announcement was 30 trillion US dollars that will be used by these countries jointly to invest. They already mentioned that they have 10 projects identified, 30 more on the pipeline, and they are trying to work together. And again, because they have this sort of political and cultural alignment. The problem, however, is that geopolitics has shifted. So we don't really know from the European perspective if the US will be the same after the elections in November. We also don't know from the European perspective if the European partners, because if you look to the list of these countries, you have the EU, but you also have Germany, you also have Italy, you also have France, and you have Estonia. So we are, let's say, a market, but we are not a federation, meaning that this is an internal problem that is sometimes difficult to solve, because we see European partners competing against European Union in some of these markets, making everything even more complex. So I would say that this clarity and coherence is perhaps the weak point from the European Union perspective for the implementation of the partnerships. Also, if I may, just before closing, if I may, it's also important to understand that we Europeans, we are not really the best at mining. And the reason for that, it's clear. I mean, the biggest mining companies are not from Europe. We stopped mining in the 80s, 70s, 80s because of internal pressure. But we are very good building infrastructure. Mr. Lodge mentioned the energy. I mean, we are brilliant in that. So perhaps these partnerships could be, in a way, shaped into transportation, into energy infrastructure, because in those particular areas, the EU is leading. And I believe that could be a strong input where, together with the local partners, we can really make a difference. Not necessarily mining, because mining, it's a completely different business, and I would say even more complex than creating the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Vitor. And one of the things that I see emerging from what you've said, but also what Mr. Lodge was saying, is that we are trying to solve a multi-dimension, unknown equation around an industry that already itself is transitioning, is shifting, and is trying to adapt to a new paradigm. And when I say industry, I'm playing fast and loose with the word, because of course we know that mining covers everything from one man and a shovel to the megapits. And in Africa, we do have that huge breadth. And actually, perhaps I can come to you with this question, Mr. Clerici, because it builds on the two elements we've been discussing here. EIB, as we've discussed, is both a policy actor and a financial institution, and as such, will take a very in-depth technical view of risk of mining and mineral projects, but also risk on a country ecosystem level. So how are you approaching these risks? How is the EIB viewing the de-risking of these investment destinations? And I see already that in the Q&A, we have several questions about how EIB would perhaps consider extending to aspects of the mining universe that we don't usually associate with the type of finance that you specialize in, particularly artisanal and small-scale mining. So yes, to realize ambitions, we need to manage risk. How do you approach the risk that you have to consider?
Thank you very much for this very complex question. I think that we need to have a sort of a comprehensive approach, if I may say so. And in our case, we give a very strong priorities to those projects we prioritize sustainability, transparency, and long-term value creation. If we talk about the African context, there are particular challenges that we see, and these have to do with infrastructure, with governance, and with environmental sustainabilities. What we do, as I said, it's a comprehensive approach to the risks, but let me maybe point out a few key parameters for us. The first one that I want to mention is, once again, the environmental and social standards. The EIB applies stringent environmental and social standard assessment to all the projects that we do. We ensure also in this field that the mining and mineral ventures have to comply with the EU sustainability and human rights standards. How do we do that? When we assess projects, we evaluate the potential impact of this project on biodiversity, on water resources, but also on local communities. And as I said in my first intervention, we want to promote responsible mining practices that have a minimal environmental effect, degradation, and uphold to the social rights. The second aspect, which is key, is the economic viability and the governance. The EIB examines the economic viability of mining projects, and to do this, we consider several aspects. Among others, I can mention market demand, the resource availability, and the long-term profitability of the project. But we also assess the political and the governance risks in the host country, such as, for instance, the regulatory stability, the legal framework, and the risk of corruption, so that we can ensure that the project that we finance are conducing for a profitable investment. You mentioned the technical aspects of the project. Indeed, you know that the EIB is a special, in a way, bank because we have a very high number of engineers which work for the bank that are specialized in the various sectors that the bank finances. So we look at the technical feasibility of the project and the infrastructure. We evaluate the technical feasibility of mining operations as well. So we look at the availability of the infrastructure in terms of transport, energy, etc. The technology which is used in the extraction and the processing, and the overall execution plan of a project. All the projects need to meet the technical standards of the EIB and need to ensure that there is operational efficiency and risk mitigation. This is valid for many projects that we look for, the project that we look both on the private side, but we also look at the public sector projects. And in particular, if we talk about public sector, we are in contact with the sovereigns and sub-sovereigns on the possibility to finance enabling infrastructure and capacity building, but also with maybe public banks to support SMEs on research and development and sustainable mining projects. What are the key aspects that we assess in terms of risks and where we try to find ways to de-risk them? Usually in the project that we finance, we see that the critical issues today are the commodity price volatility, the ESG, as I mentioned, but also it's critical the fact that today there is an insufficient pipeline maturity and hence an high credit risk of the companies that are dealing with this project. And in this respect, I want to mention one particular point, if I may. It's the fact that the bank has also the capacity to provide for technical assistance. What does it mean? It means that we are able to provide support for those projects which are not yet to a stage where we call it bankable, so that we can help this project growth up to a level when they could be financed either by the bank or by other partners. So that's not important. And in particular, we have a CRM, technical assistance facility, which has been approved by the EIB board back in September last year. And now it's in the last stages of finalization of the various documentation with the European Commission, in particular with the IMPA. So it should be very soon operational. And in this respect, the bank will have 10 million available for project preparation, which will go from very early identification projects to the last mile support. And the facility will be open to projects in all the countries of OACP. So for all the countries that are represented by Mr. Lodge. And I think it will be a good opportunity for projects to develop. You mentioned at the beginning, one of the issues that we see, especially when now I talk from the, let's say, the financing part of the EIB, is that there is a scarcity of bankable projects. It meets the requirement that I've been mentioning. Hence, the need that we've seen to help developing projects, because there is a need to create, let's say, a sort of momentum, have a number of projects that will bring then others into the pipeline, if I may say so, and then develop a much larger pipeline of projects. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I hear what you're saying about fostering not just projects, but also an ecosystem where more of these projects can emerge. When you mentioned the lack of maturity of value chains, I think that's an often misunderstood point. We are trying to connect dots which may not necessarily exist. So creating the links as well as the individual operations is an incredibly complex endeavor. I understand from my colleagues that perhaps Isabelle Magne has joined again. Could she perhaps just let us know if she's online? I see that she's online, but it seems she has been muted again. My goodness. This is the difficulties of these online gatherings. Okay, well, I think what we will do is ask Mrs. Magne upon conclusion of the event to perhaps share some views with us in writing, and we can raise them in a next conversation. We have, as usual, covered about half of the questions that I had for you, but I don't want to be selfish, and I see that there's already dozens of questions in the Q&A. Quite a few of these questions tend to how EIB would position in terms of ASM, in terms of upcoming strategic partnerships. So I'm going to park those just for a little bit and come back to perhaps a wider question, which groups some of the ones that have emerged in the Q&A. And it touches on one of the points that you raised, Vitor, and I'd like to hear perhaps from Mr. Lodge on this issue. How can the EU actually ensure, or perhaps, you know, in its holistic strategy, make sure that its MOUs and strategic partnerships with African countries do not exacerbate existing tensions or even conflicts for access to critical minerals? Of course, the Great Lakes region is top of mind, but there is competition both within member states of the EU and amongst investment destinations, even in the same region. Is there perhaps, and maybe this links also to the strategy that you are currently discussing with African countries, is there perhaps value in more regional approaches? Or are there other tools we could investigate to perhaps foster more integrated approaches? I'm going to come to Mr. Lodge first, but then please step in, Vitor and Mr. Clerici, if you have further comments.
All right, thank you for that question, but let me at the outset say that I can't speak for the European Union. We are long-standing partners, but that is a more a question directed at the EU in terms of their intent. What we are in a position to say, however, is that it's very, very clear there are some basic conditions that are required if one is to harness this mineral wealth and make it a tool for development. And this applies to all facets of economic activity, where we need a legal framework, we need a governance structure, we need law and order, we need security, etc. And in a sense, that is also reaffirming the very point that I made, which is in terms of locating critical raw materials along a certain continuum, which is not just a trade product, but rather also linked to security partnerships. And if I might use that to segue slightly into underscoring the power of partnerships. So Mr. Ceviche mentioned the possibility of this technical facility, but more broadly, partnerships are going to be central if we are going to move forward. So of course, we have had this long-standing partnership with the European Union, which we hope to leverage, extend, because we see the value of this approach on critical raw materials to be beyond just the narrow scope of critical raw materials. For us, it is almost as if we are trying to present a new development model in terms of how we can escape commodity dependence and really deliver the sustainable development that our countries need. Linked to that, in terms of partnerships, however, is this other manifestation of partnerships. The DRC and Angola, along with not only the European Union, but also the US. I think it is the first time we are seeing this kind of intervention on critical raw materials. We know that the EU has now formally become a member of the Mineral Securities Pact. Security Pact, sorry. So we understand that. But here is an example in terms of building infrastructure, establishing partnerships, which multi-stakeholders partnerships, which can again harness critical raw materials as a tool for development. So there are many different approaches, and that's why what we have crafted in terms of our position paper is in a sense a kind of base model in terms of elements and approaches, but its treatment on a both national and regional level are going to be specific to the country's holdings. I know that, for example, the focus of our discussion today is on Africa, but again, just to exemplify the approach of a broad collection of countries such as ours, in both the Pacific and the Caribbean, they do have recorded levels of high levels of critical raw materials. The problem there, or the challenge, is that they tend to be sea-based or ocean-based. And of course, here, the issue, and in fact, the quality, again, this is scientifically proven, that the quality of those ocean-based critical raw materials tends to be far higher than land-based critical raw materials. However, A, the technology does not yet exist to fully harness them, and B, even if the technology existed, these two regions, ocean-based regions, are grappling with a tension, which is also embedded in your question, by the way, between economic pursuits and other imperatives. And here the imperative is in terms of will mining of critical raw materials on the seabed impair the economics of a dominant sector in the Pacific, which is fisheries, or impair a dominant sector in the Caribbean, which is tourism. So these are always contemplations, reflections that are necessary for all policymakers and stakeholders to measure in terms of how we move forward on this. And here, what I'm already proud of, even if we don't see the concrete results of the implementation of these strategic partnerships, is that there's a stronger, heightened involvement of the respective local communities and non-state actors, which are adamant that we need a space for them to be true partners in this exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a specific question on the role of civil society in shaping not just the partnerships, but the entire economic redesign that we're discussing here. So maybe we'll come back to that. I did want to go to you, Victor, to rebound on what we've just discussed, but also take this opportunity. You mentioned competing models, a variety of partners and competitors. Sometimes some actors can be both. As we're sort of seeing the race for critical minerals heat up, a lot of competition and tension, it's very likely that strategic partnerships will evolve. So what do you see as the priorities that we need to keep in mind as we see that evolution? But also, how do you think that we can reassess the strategic partnership strategy, for lack of a better word?
Thank you, Ludwig. Before addressing your question, just let me highlight two things that I believe they are important. One is that one of the most prized conditions from the investor's perspective is stability. Not only political stability, but also regulatory stability, meaning that most of the mining investors, they would prefer a more strict regulation. I mean, dealing with all the ESG conditions, but strict but stable. And this is better than a regulation that is changed every 3 or 4 years, which is something that we are now noticing in some African countries because of the, again, from the perspective of the producing countries, they see this as an opportunity to try to develop. And of course, they are changing regulations, and this is not something that investors would like. Also, and if I may, because Mr. Lodge mentioned the Lobito corridor, and I believe this is an excellent example, or on a perspective that the European Union could use to combine the expectations of artisanal and small-scale mining and also addressing the ESG requirements that Mr. Clenchi was mentioning. For instance, it's clear for most of us working in the sector that we cannot ask the artisanal and small-scale mining sector to have the same level of delivery that you could ask from large-scale mining. If you are talking about environmental protection, all these conditions, social protection, etc., it's almost impossible for individual small-scale miners to deliver on that. Nevertheless, there is a huge social value on artisanal small-scale mining. I mean, these are people, if you want, from the fairness perspective, this is probably the most fair distribution of wealth. I mean, it's to the local people, to the communities living nearby the area. And of course, the European Union knows that. And that's the reason why in many of these projects and I would say also policy development, the European Union is worried with the artisanal small-scale mining sector. But at the same time, we are trying to push forward ESG conditions that are to met by these people. So the Lobito corridor, I was mentioning it because it's, if you look to the map, and if you understand in that corridor where we have the mineral deposits, and in which of those mineral deposits you might have large-scale mining, meaning the miners that are really providing on the best ESG capacity. And at the same time, if in these mineral deposits, or at least in some of them, you can also have artisanal small-scale mining, because in some cases they can work side by side, then that should be, I would say, a priority for the development of a cluster in that location. And by a cluster, we are talking not only about the mining industry, but we are also talking about all the enabling factors. So we can have an industry, a local industry dealing with maintenance. We can have the energy infrastructure, all these factors combined, and that would make a difference. Again, we have a coherence problem, again, from the European perspective, because these things are not clear. And either we are very pragmatic, meaning that basically we go for the minerals and we don't care, which of course it's not aligned with European values, or we need to have some flexibility, because if we are stick to the values only, then we're not giving some developing countries the opportunity to grow and to develop, in fact, at a faster pace. Now, addressing your question, what I believe it's also something that you could do is to invest on soft diplomacy, if you want to. There are interesting examples of, I mean, from Australia, for instance, they created the Minerals for Development Center a couple of years ago. That was a project combining universities, and they were basically investing on capacity building in African and Pacific countries, basically inviting the people working in the ministries, so in mining directorates, in geological service from these countries, to come to Australia and to see I would say hand in hand, so, or hands-on if you prefer, the reality of the mining sector and how it could be developed, how it could be enhanced, and basically tell them this is possible also in your countries, and we are here to support you. And this is that creates relationships also between people, and this is something that the Australians were very effective, and something that we can also learn from if we want to push forward these partnerships away from the, let's say, from the formal, if you want, from the design perspective. We need to go further. We need to go to the sites, and we need to work there. And this is clear, and this is still missing. Thank you.
So we are basically addressing a multi-level, multi-perspective issue, and at the same time needing more coherence in order to deal with the complexity. I'm perhaps going to let everybody have a chance to respond to some of these points, but I'd like to come to you, Mr. Clerici, with a question that I find quite interesting, because one of the things we mentioned is that, of course, strategic partnerships have been in progress and developing and evolving for 2 years at least. But we now have the rise of strategic projects. The CRM Act was adopted and enacted in May. The Commission immediately opened up an application, a call for applications for strategic projects, 170 applications. Whether we rejoice in that or bemoan that number is something we can debate, but 49 of those were outside the EU, with very limited alignment with strategic partnership countries, as I understand it. So one of the questions is, as Vitor was mentioning, perhaps the value of clustering. How can EIB perhaps balance its very ambitious climate policy? And you did mention that the CRM position is very linked to that, with the current absence of renewable energy infrastructure to sustain energy-intensive activities like mining and all of the mineral activities. If we talk about beneficiation and further industrialization, we need impressive amounts of energy deployment, ideally renewable. Are you linking those two? Is this an element in how you assess both energy and mining and minerals projects? And perhaps, are there some recommendations or requirements that you would like to see better considered by all parties in structuring this kind of cluster?
Yes, thank you very much. I think, you know, that the two things are not, let's say, mutually exclusive one for the other. When we finance projects, we do finance obviously CRM, but the bank is very much active in financing also renewable energy, innovation, and other things. So there is no a clear focus only on one sector. The bank has a lot of eligibility criteria for projects that can be financed. And the bank is looking exactly at what you said, to create a value chain. So whenever we look at the project, we start from the source. In this case, clearly we want to see an increase in renewable energy, because this is a key priority for the bank. I don't know if you're aware, but the EIB is the EU Climate Bank, and we dedicate at least 50% of any activity, any yearly activity, to projects which are climate related. And this has been constantly increasing, and we are not, let's say, compromising on this aspect whenever we finance projects in the EU or outside the EU. So the possibility to have projects which are financed by renewable energies is essential for us. But how we tackle this? we go exactly to finance the renewable energy capacity. The bank is one of the largest financiers in the world for renewable energy projects. When we have started and with our new energy lending policy, the EIB has been the first multilateral bank in the world to cut all the financing for fossil fuel projects, and has decided to just foster the possibility to promote renewable energy. Why? Because we think that the role of a bank as the EIB, as a promotional development bank, is the role of, let's say, to be at the forefront of the technical advancements. So to finance those projects which can then benefit in the long term, have benefits in the long term. And hence we have decided to just no more finance, let's say, fossil fuel projects, but just to finance renewable energy. We know it's challenging, but that's, we think, it's the role of an institution plus a bank as the EIB. And for this, as I mentioned, we have realized that we need to support those who are developing projects and not to leave them alone. And hence the bank has these very large technical assistance facilities, which are many. I mentioned this for CRM because it's dedicated to what we are discussing here. But we have technical assistance facilities for all the let's say the project that we finance, just because we understand that we are demanding in terms of being respectful for social environmental standard, and we need to help promoters to develop up to the extent, as I mentioned, to bring projects to a level when they can be financed. If I may just take one additional minute, I was quickly going through the questions. I think that there is a recurrent question about the MOU that I mentioned. I think, and now this correlates to the MOU that the European Union is signing. I think that these are two sides of the same coin. I mean, the European Union, obviously, it's more on the political level. The Union is signing many MOUs, not only with African countries, but with Latin American countries, North American and Asian countries. And this goes in the direction of supporting the critical raw material act of the Union. The bank, let's say, is part of the European Union, but it focuses on the financing of projects. So what we do is to go more into the details and to see how we can develop specific ways to promote the development of projects with the various countries. But once again, it's not that signing an MOU with Rwanda exclude the fact that we look at projects in Mauritania or DRC or Nigeria or else. Now I'm just mentioning countries like this. It's just that, you know, we are trying whenever possible to have a consistent approach, because we think that, you know, in such a difficult environment, having a pragmatic approach and deciding with our counterpart where to focus could bring then a better end result for the financing of projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are almost at time, but I'm going to ask perhaps Mr. Lodge and then Vitor, if you have a final, very brief statement. I, for one, will definitely be walking away with the statement that CRM are not a product. They're a value chain, and therefore at the nexus, as you were saying, of a whole variety of policy positions, financing expectations. So we still have much work to do to connect all those dots, and I appreciate what you were saying about you know, fostering a more pragmatic approach. Mr. Clerici, Mr. Lodge, and then Vitor, and then we'll close the webinar.
All right, thank you very much. Just briefly to underscore that in a sense, we're very ambitious and unashamedly so. We think that there's an opportunity. The secular demand for critical raw materials is exceedingly high. Just an example, lithium is due to the demand for lithium is due to expand 12-fold by 2050. So this is a long haul process, and it is important to anchor that, because again, we're looking at something not only that's revolutionary, but it is aimed at sustainable development, and therefore we have to have that kind of long-term perspective. The second quick point is looking at the Draghi report. There were 87 references in the Draghi report to critical raw materials. One of the most interesting elements is in terms of joint purchasing. of critical raw materials by EU countries. So they were looking at the model that Japan and and South Korea, my apologies, used and trying to replicate that on an EU-wide basis. Why I found that interesting is because one of the elements that we as OECPS are trying to pursue is also to develop clubs of CRM producing states where we can leverage higher not only prices, but of course, locked in agreement that can guarantee whether it is in terms of export income, whether it is in terms of the capacity building, the infrastructure development, the governance framework that we have all agreed upon. So there's an opportunity for OECPS countries precisely to, in a sense, harness their leverage, their political leverage at a juncture where we want to support the global thrust towards a green and digital transition. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vitor?
Yes, I would again put the focus on the coherence, because it's first we need to acknowledge that it's fair for the raw materials producing countries to increase the added value domestically, because they want to progress, they want to create more value and wealth. Then it's also important to realize that for the European Union, in order to create some sort of trust and long-term relationships, then you need to be very consistent on the policies that we are implementing. And I remember that a few years ago, Europeans and Americans, so Europe, the EU and the US, we were very concerned about Indonesia, and because Indonesia was trying to develop their nickel value chain. And in the end, when we had the pandemic, I remember seeing at Davos, one of the, I believe it was the foreign minister from Indonesia, saying it was the best, I mean, that decision was the best decision for Indonesia, because during the pandemic, the assistance that they received from the EU was zero. And in a way, these are the sort of, if you want, of the sort of combinations that hamper trust, and basically, again, show that we still need to work on the coherence of our own policies. To close, just to tell you that sometimes from the European perspective, it will be also important to have a forward-looking perspective. And we are still deciding on, for instance, on the critical raw materials list, looking to statistics and not necessarily talking with the industry and understanding what is on the development pipeline. And this is an advantage that other countries like Japan, that was just mentioned, have. And because of that, we are still, again, in need of improving our own set of regulations, again, to improve coherence. In our case, it's a problem with cartels. So the regulations against cartels basically don't allow companies to talk directly as the Japanese Kairatsu do with JOGMEC. Again, another constraint that we are facing. On the positive side, we are very good at infrastructure development. We are very good at industry. And we also have an industry, which is oil and gas, that basically has a lot of know-how and that we could use to foster cooperation, international cooperation with also in the raw material sector. Thank you.
Much food for thought on coherence and minding our own backyard, but also leveraging strengths wherever they lie. I am going to close it out and give us all a pat on the back because we're only 5 minutes late. I want to thank you for these very, very insightful discussions. We will, of course, at ECFR, continue to work on these issues. We could not raise the majority of the questions that were in the Q&A, but we will make sure that we keep those in mind as we continue to publish and to host events. We will keep you informed of upcoming events on these and relating topics. And I'm very sorry that INTPA could not join us today due to technical issues. So we will make sure that next steps, we reopen the conversation and get their important perspective as this agenda evolves. So thank you very much and have a very good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.